The night they laughed at me was the night everything began. The splash of red wine hit my black uniform before I even realized what had happened. 1 second I was balancing a silver tray filled with sparkling water glasses. The next, cold liquid was dripping down the front of my blouse while silence spread through the ballroom like a ripple across a lake. I froze. Not because of the stain. Not because the designer fabric was ruined. The uniform wasn't even mine. It belonged to the agency. I froze because I knew exactly what would happen next. Laughter. Soft at first. Then louder. Sharper. More confident. The kind of laughter that only came from people who had never worried about rent, medical bills, or choosing between groceries and gas. I lowered my eyes toward the marble floor and swallowed hard. "Oops," Charlotte Blackwood said, her voice dripping with false innocence. "I didn't see you standing there." The crystal chandelier above us scattered golden light across the ballroom. The charity gala looked like something from a movie. Men in tailored tuxedos. Women wrapped in silk and diamonds. Servers moving silently between tables worth more than my entire apartment building. And me. Grace Carter. 25 years old. Housemaid. Invisible. Charlotte lifted her champagne glass and smiled at her friends. "Well? Don't just stand there. Clean yourself up." More laughter followed. Nobody told her to stop. Nobody told her she was wrong. Why would they? To them, I wasn't a guest. I wasn't family. I wasn't even a person worth defending. I was simply the maid. I bent down and picked up the napkins that had fallen from my tray. My hands trembled slightly, but years of practice helped me keep my face calm. My mother always said dignity wasn't something other people gave you. It was something you refused to surrender. Even when they tried to take it. Especially then. "I'm sorry," I whispered automatically. The words slipped out before I could stop them. Sorry had become a habit. Sorry for existing. Sorry for being in the way. Sorry for not belonging in rooms like this. Charlotte rolled her eyes. "Of course you are." The conversation around her resumed. The guests moved on. The moment was already forgotten. At least by them. I turned toward the service hallway, hoping to escape before anyone noticed the tears gathering behind my eyes. The stain would wash out. Maybe. The embarrassment wouldn't. The hallway was quiet compared to the ballroom. Dimmer. Cooler. Real. I leaned against the wall and finally allowed myself to breathe. My chest hurt. Not from the humiliation. Not even from the exhaustion after working 14 straight hours. It hurt because earlier that afternoon I'd received another letter from the hospital. Another reminder that my mother's treatment couldn't wait forever. I reached into my apron pocket and touched the folded paper. Just touching it felt heavy. Like carrying a storm in my pocket. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I imagined what life would feel like if I didn't have to fight every single day. If I could rest. If I could stop pretending everything was fine. Then I heard footsteps. Slow. Measured. Expensive shoes against polished stone. I opened my eyes. At the far end of the hallway stood Ethan Blackwood. He hadn't said a word. Hadn't moved. Hadn't looked away. The billionaire's expression revealed nothing. Yet somehow, in that moment, I had the strange feeling he had seen everything. I should have looked away. That would have been easier. Safer. But Ethan Blackwood stood at the end of that hallway with his hands in his pockets, watching me with those calm gray eyes that never seemed to reveal what he was thinking. The silence stretched between us. Heavy. Uncomfortable. I quickly wiped beneath my eyes before he could see the tears gathering there. Not that it mattered. Men like Ethan did not notice women like me. At least that was what I had always believed. You missed a spot. His voice was low and steady. I blinked in confusion. Excuse me? He nodded toward my sleeve. A streak of wine still stained the cuff. Heat rushed into my cheeks. Of course that was what he noticed. Not the humiliation. Not the embarrassment. Just the stain. I will take care of it, I said quietly. I know you will. For some reason, that answer caught me off guard. There was no mockery in his voice. No pity either. Just a simple statement. As though he expected me to handle it because that was what I always did. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Somewhere beyond the hallway doors, laughter drifted from the ballroom. Crystal glasses clinked together. A string quartet continued playing for guests who would never remember the names of the people serving them. Why did you not defend yourself? Ethan finally asked. The question surprised me even more than his presence. I stared at him. Defend myself from what? One corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. My sister. I looked away. The marble floor suddenly seemed very interesting. Because she is your sister. That is not an answer. I swallowed. It is the only one I have. His gaze lingered on me. I could feel it. Careful. Measuring. The way someone studies a puzzle they cannot quite solve. Then his phone vibrated. The moment broke. He glanced at the screen before slipping the device back into his pocket. Go home, Grace. Hearing my name from him felt strange. Almost unsettling. Most people in the house called me Maid, Staff, or simply Girl. Yet Ethan had used my name without hesitation. There is still work to finish, I replied. There will always be work. For the first time that evening, his expression shifted. Only slightly. But enough for me to notice. There was exhaustion there. The kind that money could not fix. The kind I recognized because I carried it myself. Before I could respond, another voice echoed through the hallway. Ethan. Victoria Blackwood appeared near the ballroom entrance. Elegant. Perfect. Smiling. Her eyes landed on me and instantly cooled. There you are, she said to him. Everyone is waiting. Ethan never looked away from me. Then they can wait another minute. Victoria's smile faltered. Only for a second. But I saw it. So did she. The air suddenly felt different. Sharper somehow. More dangerous than before. I lowered my eyes immediately. Whatever was happening had nothing to do with me. Or at least it should not have. Yet as Ethan finally turned and walked toward the ballroom, I had the uncomfortable feeling that something had changed. Not in the house. Not in the family. In him. And somehow, that frightened me far more than Charlotte's laughter ever could. The letter was waiting for me when I got home. Folded neatly beneath my apartment door. White paper. Blue hospital logo. The sight of it made my stomach drop before I even picked it up. I stood in the dim hallway for a full minute, staring at my name printed across the envelope. Grace Carter. As if a few simple letters could carry the weight of an entire life. My apartment smelled faintly of laundry detergent and old books. Usually that smell comforted me. That night it did not. I sat at the tiny kitchen table beside the window and carefully opened the envelope. My hands already knew what the letter would say. The words still hurt anyway. Additional treatment required. Recommended timeline. Estimated costs. Payment arrangements. Every sentence felt colder than the last. I read the page twice before lowering it onto the table. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, silence settled over the room. My mother was sleeping at the care center 20 miles away. She would wake up tomorrow and ask me if I had eaten dinner. She would smile and pretend everything was fine. She always did. Even now. Even after months of treatments and endless appointments. I rubbed my eyes and looked toward the framed photograph sitting beside the lamp. It had been taken 6 years earlier. Before the diagnosis. Before hospital rooms became familiar. Before life started measuring itself in bills and test results. I was smiling in that picture. So was she. Sometimes I barely recognized either of us. The next morning arrived too quickly. By 6:30, I was already back at Blackwood Manor. The estate looked beautiful in the early sunlight. Perfect hedges. Perfect fountains. Perfect stone walls. Everything polished. Everything controlled. Nothing like the uncertainty waiting in my pocket. The folded hospital letter felt heavier with every step. I spent the morning changing linens, dusting shelves, and preparing guest rooms. The work helped. As long as my hands stayed busy, my mind stayed quiet. Around noon, I climbed a ladder in the West Library to organize books along the upper shelves. The room smelled of leather and cedar wood. Peaceful. Almost comforting. I was reaching for a heavy hardcover when dizziness suddenly washed over me. The room tilted. Just slightly. But enough. I grabbed the shelf and closed my eyes. Breakfast had been a single cup of coffee. Dinner the night before had been half a sandwich. Money spent on groceries was money not spent elsewhere. I waited for the feeling to pass. It mostly did. You should sit down. The voice came from below. My eyes opened. Ethan stood near the ladder, one hand resting against a bookshelf. I had not heard him enter. I am fine, I answered automatically. No, you are not. His tone was calm. Not judgmental. Just certain. I climbed down carefully and adjusted my sleeves. I have work to finish. You almost fell. Almost is not the same as did. For a second, something flickered across his face. Amusement perhaps. Or frustration. I could not tell. Then his gaze moved briefly toward the folded paper sticking out of my apron pocket. His expression changed. The amusement vanished. Bad news? He asked quietly. My fingers instinctively covered the letter. I forced a small smile. Nothing I cannot handle. Ethan looked at me for a long moment. Long enough to make my heartbeat quicken. Then he nodded once. That is what you always say. And somehow, hearing those words frightened me because it sounded like he was starting to know me. The sound of high heels against marble usually meant trouble. By the time I heard them approaching that afternoon, I already knew who it was. Charlotte Blackwood entered the breakfast room carrying her phone and an expression that suggested she had just discovered a new way to entertain herself. Two of her friends followed close behind, laughing about something I had not heard. I kept polishing the silverware. Experience had taught me that drawing attention to myself only made things worse. There she is, Charlotte announced. Our favorite employee. Her friends looked at me the way people sometimes looked at museum exhibits. Curious. Detached. Barely interested enough to hide it. Grace, Charlotte continued, we need a favor. I set the silver tray down carefully. Of course. Wonderful. Her smile widened. Tonight, Victoria is hosting a private dinner. Important guests. Investors. People who matter. I nodded. The dining room is already prepared. That is not the favor. Her friends exchanged amused glances. Something tightened in my chest. Charlotte stepped closer and lowered her voice just enough to sound conspiratorial. Victoria thought it would be fun if the staff participated in the evening. The word fun immediately worried me. Participated how? Charlotte's smile became brighter. You will serve drinks while wearing one of the vintage uniforms from storage. One of her friends laughed before quickly covering her mouth. I understood instantly. The vintage uniforms had not been used in decades. They were outdated, oversized, and intentionally humiliating. Costumes from another era. Not professional attire. A joke. I do not think Mrs. Blackwood would approve, I said carefully. Victoria already approved. Charlotte tilted her head. Unless you are refusing? Refusing was not really an option. I needed the job. They knew that. Everyone in this house knew that. No, I answered quietly. I am not refusing. Satisfaction flashed across Charlotte's face. Perfect. The entire afternoon passed with a knot in my stomach. By 6 o'clock, the guests had begun arriving. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway. Laughter echoed through the halls. Crystal glasses reflected warm light from chandeliers overhead. Meanwhile, I stood alone in the staff room staring at the uniform hanging from a hook. The fabric looked ridiculous. Even worse than I remembered. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. Dignity is something you refuse to surrender. My mother's voice echoed inside my mind. The uniform could embarrass me. It could not define me. 10 minutes later, I entered the dining room carrying a tray of sparkling water. Conversation immediately slowed. Not stopped. Just enough. Just enough for people to notice. A few smiles appeared around the table. Some sympathetic. Most amused. Heat rushed into my face, but I kept walking. One step. Then another. Professional. Steady. Invisible. That was the plan. Then I heard a chair scrape across the floor. Every conversation stopped completely. I looked up. Ethan Blackwood had just entered the room. His gaze moved across the guests. Across Victoria. Across Charlotte. Then finally landed on me. For a second, absolute silence settled over the room. And for the first time since I arrived at Blackwood Manor, Charlotte looked nervous. The room felt smaller after Ethan walked in. Not because anything had changed. Because everyone had changed. The laughter that had floated through the dining room seconds earlier disappeared so quickly it was almost unsettling. Charlotte lowered her glass. Victoria's confident smile tightened around the edges. Even the guests seemed unsure whether to continue their conversations. I kept my eyes on the tray in my hands. That was safer. Ethan moved toward the table with the calm confidence of someone who never needed to announce his presence. People noticed him anyway. They always did. He greeted a few investors, exchanged polite words, then stopped beside Victoria. Interesting choice, he said. His voice was quiet, but in the silence, everyone heard it. Victoria gave a small laugh. What do you mean? Ethan glanced toward me. The uniform. For a brief second, nobody spoke. Victoria recovered first. It was meant to be playful. Was it? His question hung in the air. Not aggressive. Not confrontational. Somehow worse. Charlotte suddenly became very interested in her water glass. Victoria smiled again, but it looked forced now. You are reading too much into it. Ethan said nothing. He simply held her gaze for a few seconds before taking his seat. The conversation slowly resumed, though something felt different. The evening continued, but the atmosphere never fully recovered. I served drinks. Cleared plates. Refilled glasses. The usual routine. Yet I noticed something strange. Every time someone looked at the uniform, they quickly looked away. As if Ethan's reaction had changed the rules. As if what had seemed amusing earlier no longer felt quite so funny. Around 9 o'clock, the dinner finally ended. Guests drifted toward the terrace overlooking the gardens. The warm summer air carried the scent of roses through the open doors. I escaped to the service corridor with a sense of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. The tray felt heavier than ever. My feet ached. My shoulders ached. My heart ached most of all. I reached the staff room and closed the door behind me. For the first time all evening, I allowed myself to breathe. The vintage uniform suddenly felt unbearable. I sat on a wooden bench and stared at the floor. The hospital letter remained folded inside my apron pocket. Another reminder waiting for me. Another problem with no solution. I rubbed my temples and closed my eyes. A soft knock interrupted the silence. "Come in," I said. The door opened. Mrs. Harper stepped inside. At 72, the longtime housekeeper moved slower these days, but her eyes remained kind. Kinder than anyone else's in the manor. She carried a small paper bag. "I thought you might not have eaten dinner," she said. My throat tightened immediately. Inside the bag was a turkey sandwich and a small apple. Nothing fancy. Nothing expensive. Somehow it felt like the greatest gift in the world. "Thank you," I whispered. Mrs. Harper smiled gently. "You remind me of someone." "Who?" Her expression softened. "My younger self." I laughed quietly. "Then I hope things worked out better for you." She looked toward the window where darkness had settled over the estate. "Eventually they did." Before leaving, she paused at the doorway. "Not everyone in this house sees what they pretend not to see, Grace." I frowned. "What does that mean?" But Mrs. Harper only smiled and left. 20 minutes later, after changing back into my regular clothes, I stepped outside into the cool night air. The gardens were nearly empty. Moonlight reflected across the fountain. Everything seemed peaceful. Then I noticed a figure standing alone near the greenhouse. Tall. Motionless. Watching the lights inside the manor. Ethan Blackwood. And for reasons I could not explain, he looked lonelier than anyone I had ever seen. The night air felt cooler away from the house. I should have gone home. My shift had ended nearly 30 minutes earlier. My feet hurt. My back hurt. Tomorrow would arrive too soon, just like every other day. Yet somehow I found myself standing beneath the shadow of an oak tree, looking toward the greenhouse where Ethan stood alone. The glass walls reflected silver moonlight. Beyond them, rows of flowers stretched into the darkness. He had not noticed me. Or maybe he had. It was impossible to tell with him. For a long moment neither of us moved. Then he spoke without turning around. "You are still here." I almost jumped. "I was leaving." "You have been saying that for 5 minutes." Heat rushed into my cheeks. I looked toward the driveway. He was right. I had not moved. Ethan finally turned. His jacket was gone. His sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. For the first time since I had met him, he looked less like a billionaire and more like an ordinary man who happened to be tired. "Do you come here often?" I asked before I could stop myself. The question surprised both of us. One corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "The greenhouse?" I nodded. "Sometimes." His eyes drifted toward the flowers behind the glass. "My mother loved this place." The answer caught me off guard. Nobody talked about Ethan's mother. Not in the house. Not at family dinners. Not even the staff. It was one of those subjects everyone silently avoided. "Mrs. Harper told me she was kind," I said carefully. Something softened in his expression. "She was." The silence that followed felt different from the others we had shared. Less uncomfortable. More honest. A breeze moved through the gardens. Somewhere in the distance, water trickled from the fountain. "She used to come here every morning," Ethan continued quietly. "Even during winter. She said flowers reminded her that difficult seasons never lasted forever." I smiled despite myself. That sounds like something my mother would say. His gaze shifted back to me. "Your mother?" I immediately regretted mentioning her. Talking about my mother usually led to questions I could not afford to answer. Questions about hospitals and treatments and bills. Questions that always made reality feel heavier. "She likes gardening," I said. "Or she used to." Ethan studied me for a moment. "The letter is about her, isn't it?" My stomach tightened instantly. I should have denied it. I should have changed the subject. Instead, I looked away. The silence answered for me. Grace. Hearing my name from him still felt strange. You do not have to carry everything alone. I laughed softly. Not because it was funny. Because it was impossible. Most people do. His eyes never left mine. No. Most people just pretend they do. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then his phone rang. The sound shattered the moment. Ethan glanced at the screen and sighed. Whatever peace had existed disappeared from his face. I have to go. I nodded. Of course he did. People like Ethan always had somewhere to be. Important meetings. Important decisions. Important lives. As he started walking back toward the manor, he suddenly stopped. Grace. I looked up. Yes? You should not have been wearing that uniform tonight. My heart skipped unexpectedly. Before I could respond, he continued. You deserved better. Then he walked away. I stood alone beneath the moonlight long after he disappeared inside the house, wondering why those 3 words affected me more than every insult I had endured all year. The following week passed in a blur of early mornings and late nights. I convinced myself that the conversation in the garden had meant nothing. Ethan Blackwood had been kind. That was all. Kindness did not change reality. It did not pay hospital bills. It did not make people like Charlotte suddenly respect me. It certainly did not belong in the same sentence as someone like Ethan. So I focused on work. That was easier. Safer. By Thursday afternoon, I was cleaning one of the unused offices on the 3rd floor. The room had not been touched in months. Dust covered the bookshelves. Old boxes filled entire corners. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating tiny particles floating through the air. I worked quietly, sorting through stacks of forgotten documents. Most were financial reports. Contracts. Meeting notes. The kind of paperwork that made my eyes glaze over. Then I found a large leather portfolio wedged behind a cabinet. I frowned and carefully pulled it free. The cover was worn with age. Curious, I opened it. My breath caught instantly. Inside were sketches. Floor plans. Interior concepts. Hand-drawn furniture designs. Entire room layouts rendered with remarkable detail. For a second, I simply stared. Then a familiar ache settled in my chest. Because the designs looked exactly like the ones I used to draw. Back when I was 19. Back when I thought my future would be different. Before my mother's diagnosis. Before tuition payments became impossible. Before dreams became luxuries. I should not have done it. I knew that. Yet I found myself sitting on the floor, studying every page. The lines. The proportions. The creativity. It felt like looking at a life I had almost lived. Without thinking, I reached for a pencil from my apron pocket. An old habit. The portfolio contained a half-finished concept for a reading room. The lighting placement felt wrong. The seating arrangement interrupted the flow of the space. Before I could stop myself, I began sketching adjustments in the margin. One idea became 2. 2 became 5. Nearly 40 minutes disappeared. Interesting solution. The voice startled me so badly I nearly dropped the pencil. I looked up. Ethan stood in the doorway. My heart immediately jumped into my throat. I can explain, I said quickly, closing the portfolio. Can you? He stepped into the room. Calm as always. Impossible to read. You modified the design. Heat rushed into my face. I should not have touched it. Ethan ignored that completely. Why did you move the seating area? I blinked. What? The chairs. He nodded toward the sketch. Why? The question caught me off guard. Nobody had ever asked me that before. Nobody had cared. I swallowed. Natural light. He remained silent. Waiting. The original design forced people to sit with the windows behind them, I continued quietly. Moving the seating forward creates a more comfortable reading space and makes the room feel larger. Ethan studied the page. Then he looked at me. Really looked at me. You know design. It was not a question. My fingers tightened around the pencil. I used to. The silence that followed felt endless. Finally, Ethan spoke. Used to? I stared at the floor. I was studying interior architecture before I left school. For the first time since I had met him, Ethan looked genuinely surprised. Not because I had spoken. Not because I had answered. Because he had just discovered that the maid everyone overlooked had been hiding an entire life nobody had bothered to ask about. The next 3 days felt different. Not because anyone said anything. Because Ethan had started noticing things. Small things. The kind of details nobody else cared enough to see. He never mentioned the portfolio again. He never brought up architecture. Yet somehow I would find design magazines left on tables I happened to clean. Articles marked with folded corners. Books appearing in rooms where they had not been before. At first I assumed it was coincidence. Then I stopped believing in coincidence. Unfortunately, Charlotte noticed the change too. And Charlotte hated mysteries she could not control. The trouble started on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Victoria was hosting another gathering at the manor. Nothing as large as the gala. Just a private luncheon with a few friends. The kind of event that required perfect flowers, perfect food, and perfect appearances. I spent most of the morning preparing guest rooms and arranging fresh centerpieces. By noon, the house buzzed with activity. At 1 o'clock, a sharp voice echoed through the hallway. Where is it? I looked up from the arrangement I was carrying. Victoria stood near the grand staircase, visibly upset. Several staff members gathered nearby. The bracelet was here this morning, she said. Now it is gone. The bracelet was famous inside the family. A diamond heirloom passed through generations. Valuable enough to make everyone nervous. My stomach tightened immediately. Problems like this never ended well for people in my position. Staff members searched guest rooms. Drawers. Closets. Every corner of the house. Nearly an hour passed. Then Charlotte appeared carrying a small velvet jewelry box. I found it. Relief flooded the hallway. Until she opened the box. Empty. Charlotte slowly looked toward me. The silence arrived first. Then the suspicion. Interesting, she said softly. My heart dropped. What does that mean? Charlotte tilted her head. This box was in the laundry room. So? Near your locker. Every face turned toward me. I felt the shift immediately. The assumptions. The conclusions. The judgment. I did not take anything, I said. My voice sounded smaller than I intended. Victoria crossed her arms. Then perhaps you can explain why it was found there. I cannot explain something I did not do. Charlotte laughed lightly. Convenient answer. The room seemed to shrink around me. I had spent years earning trust through hard work. Years proving myself reliable. Yet all it took was one accusation for that trust to disappear. Because trust had never really belonged to me in the first place. It belonged to my position. And positions could be replaced. Search my locker, I said quietly. Search my apartment. Search anything you want. Charlotte smiled. That sounds dramatic. Because I am innocent. The words echoed through the hallway. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended me. Then another voice cut through the silence. That will not be necessary. Every head turned. Ethan stood at the top of the staircase. His expression revealed nothing. Yet something about his presence immediately changed the atmosphere. He descended slowly, one step at a time. Calm. Controlled. Certain. When he reached the bottom, his eyes settled on Charlotte. The bracelet was never stolen. Charlotte blinked. Excuse me? Ethan pulled a small object from his jacket pocket. The diamond bracelet sparkled beneath the chandelier lights. A collective gasp moved through the room. I found it this morning in the West study, he said. Exactly where Victoria left it yesterday. The silence that followed felt deafening. Charlotte's face lost all color. Victoria looked equally stunned. Meanwhile I could barely breathe. Ethan glanced toward me briefly before returning his attention to the others. Next time, he said calmly, verify your facts before accusing someone. And for the first time since I arrived at Blackwood Manor, I watched Charlotte Blackwood run out of excuses. After the bracelet incident, the house changed. Not dramatically. Not overnight. The walls remained the same. The routines remained the same. But people started watching. The staff whispered more carefully when I entered a room. Guests looked at me a second longer than before. And Charlotte avoided mentioning my name altogether. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt uneasy. Because the attention was not really about me. It was about Ethan. Everyone had seen what happened. Everyone had noticed that he stepped in without hesitation. Everyone had noticed that he believed me before anyone else did. That was what made people uncomfortable. Including me. 3 days later, I arrived at the care center after work carrying a small bouquet of daisies. They were inexpensive, but my mother loved them. The receptionist smiled when she saw me. She has been asking about you all afternoon. I laughed softly. That sounds like her. My mother sat near the window when I entered. Afternoon sunlight painted golden streaks across the blanket covering her legs. She looked smaller than I remembered. Frailier. Yet her smile remained exactly the same. There is my favorite girl. My throat tightened immediately. You say that every time. Because it is true every time. I sat beside her and handed her the flowers. For a while we talked about ordinary things. The weather. Television shows. A neighbor who kept feeding stray cats. Neither of us mentioned doctors. Neither of us mentioned bills. Sometimes pretending was easier. Eventually she studied my face. Mothers always noticed things. Something happened. It was not a question. I sighed. What makes you say that? You have that look. I laughed despite myself. What look? The one you get when your heart is confused. My eyes widened. Mom. Her smile grew. So I am right. I shook my head, but she continued watching me with gentle amusement. Tell me about him. There is no him. Grace. I groaned. His name is Ethan. Her smile immediately softened. And? I looked toward the window. How could I explain something I barely understood myself? How could I explain a man who belonged to a completely different world? A man who noticed things nobody else noticed. A man who somehow made me feel seen and nervous at the same time. He is my employer, I finally said. That sounds very convincing. I laughed again. Then the laughter faded. Nothing can happen. My mother became quiet. Because he is wealthy? Because everything is different. She reached for my hand. Her fingers felt thinner than they used to. Grace, the right people do not measure human worth the way the world does. I wanted to believe her. I truly did. But reality felt heavier than hope. When I returned to Blackwood Manor that evening, the estate seemed unusually busy. Luxury vehicles filled the driveway. Staff members hurried through the halls carrying documents and folders. Something important was happening. I stopped one of the assistants. What is going on? She looked surprised. You have not heard? Heard what? Her eyes widened. The board meeting. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. What board meeting? The assistant lowered her voice. Mr. Blackwood has spent the last week investigating financial irregularities inside the family trust. I frowned. Why? She glanced around before answering. Because someone has been lying. And for reasons I could not explain, my thoughts immediately went to Charlotte and Victoria. The next morning began with a phone call. I knew something was wrong the moment my cell phone vibrated at 6:15. Hospitals did not call that early with good news. My heart was already racing before I answered. Grace? The nurse's voice sounded gentle. Too gentle. Your mother had a difficult night. The world seemed to tilt slightly beneath me. Is she okay? A pause followed. The kind of pause that changes everything. She is stable right now, but the doctors would like to see you as soon as possible. By 7 o'clock, I was driving across the city with both hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles hurt. Rain streaked across the windshield. Traffic lights blurred through anxious tears I refused to let fall. Please be okay. Please be okay. The words repeated inside my head the entire drive. When I reached the hospital, the smell of antiseptic and coffee hit me immediately. Familiar. Unwelcome. My mother was asleep when I entered her room. Her breathing was steady. Her face looked peaceful. Too peaceful. A doctor met me in the hallway 20 minutes later. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. Additional treatment. Limited options. Time-sensitive decisions. Financial estimates that made my stomach drop. By the end, I could barely hear anything except the pounding of my own heartbeat. I thanked the doctor and walked toward the elevator in a daze. My mind raced through impossible calculations. Savings. Loans. Extra shifts. Things I could sell. Things I had already sold. The numbers never worked. They never worked. I reached the parking garage before the tears finally came. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just exhaustion spilling over after months of pretending to be stronger than I felt. I sat inside my aging sedan and stared through the windshield. For a moment, I allowed myself to break. Then someone knocked softly on the driver's side window. I looked up. My breath caught. Ethan stood outside holding an umbrella. For a second I genuinely thought I was imagining him. He opened the passenger door and sat down beside me. Neither of us spoke immediately. Rain tapped softly against the roof. How did you find me? I finally whispered. Ethan looked out through the windshield. Mrs. Harper mentioned your mother was in the hospital. My throat tightened. You came all the way here? Yes. Such a simple answer. Yet it felt impossible. I laughed weakly and wiped my eyes. You should not be here. Why? Because people like you do not sit in parking garages with people like me. Ethan turned toward me. His expression was calm. Steady. Certain. Grace. My name sounded different when he said it. Stop deciding what kind of people we are. I stared at him. Completely speechless. Then his eyes dropped toward the folder resting on my lap. The folder containing treatment estimates. Payment plans. Every fear I had been carrying alone. He did not reach for it. Did not ask permission. He simply noticed. Just like he always did. This is what the letter was about, he said quietly. I closed my eyes. There was no point pretending anymore. Yes. Silence filled the car. Heavy but somehow comforting. Then Ethan spoke again. You have been working extra shifts. I nodded. Selling things. Another nod. Skipping meals. My eyes opened immediately. How do you know that? His expression changed. Just slightly. Enough for me to realize something that made my heart stop. Ethan Blackwood had been paying attention for far longer than I ever realized. The drive back to Blackwood Manor felt strangely quiet. Ethan followed behind my car for most of the trip, never too close, never too far. When I finally pulled into the employee parking area, his vehicle continued toward the main house. I sat there for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, trying to understand what had just happened. Nobody had ever shown up for me like that before. Not when things were difficult. Not when there was nothing to gain. Yet Ethan had crossed half the city just to sit beside me in a hospital parking garage. The thought stayed with me long after I climbed into bed that night. The following evening, the manor hosted one of its largest events of the year. Hundreds of guests filled the ballroom. Business leaders. Investors. Politicians. The kind of people whose names appeared in magazines and financial reports. Staff members moved quickly through the crowds carrying trays and champagne flutes. The entire estate glowed beneath crystal chandeliers and golden light. I spent most of the evening helping coordinate service stations behind the scenes. It should have been a normal night. Then I heard my name. Grace Carter. The voice came through the ballroom speakers. Every conversation seemed to pause at once. My stomach dropped. Slowly, I turned toward the stage. Victoria Blackwood stood near the microphone. Elegant as always. Smiling as always. Dangerous as always. "There you are," she said. Hundreds of eyes followed her gaze until they landed on me. A cold feeling spread through my chest. "Would you join us for a moment?" I froze. Every instinct told me this was a mistake. But refusing would only make things worse. I walked forward through the crowd. The silence grew heavier with every step. When I reached the stage, Victoria's smile widened. "I wanted everyone to meet one of our employees," she announced. Polite laughter drifted through the room. Grace has become quite popular recently. Something about her tone made my pulse quicken. In fact, Victoria continued, some people might even think she has developed special influence within this family. More laughter followed. Softer this time. Sharper. The kind designed to embarrass without appearing cruel. I felt heat rising into my face. "Victoria," I said quietly. "Please." She ignored me. "Tell us, Grace. What is your secret?" The room waited. Investors. Guests. Staff. Everyone watching. Everyone judging. My hands trembled slightly at my sides. Then another voice cut through the silence. "I can answer that." Every head turned. Ethan stepped onto the stage. His expression remained calm, but something in his eyes warned the room to be careful. Victoria's smile disappeared immediately. Ethan took the microphone from her hand. No argument. No hesitation. Just certainty. Then he looked directly at the crowd. "Her secret," he said, "is that she works harder than anyone in this building." The ballroom became completely silent. "She takes care of people without asking for recognition. She shows up when others make excuses. She carries responsibilities most of us cannot imagine." My breath caught. Ethan turned toward me briefly before facing the audience again. "If that earns my respect, then perhaps more people should ask themselves why they have not earned it too." Not a single person laughed this time. And for the first time, I watched Victoria Blackwood realize she had just lost control of the room. The morning after the gala felt unreal. Everywhere I went, people looked at me differently. Not because I had changed. Because Ethan had spoken. In a house where status meant everything, his words carried weight. More weight than I was comfortable with. I spent the first half of the day avoiding everyone. The laundry room. Storage closets. Empty hallways. Anywhere quiet. Anywhere safe. By late afternoon, Mrs. Harper found me reorganizing supply shelves. You cannot hide forever, she said gently. I smiled without looking up. I am not hiding. Of course you are. She handed me a folded note. He asked me to give you this. My pulse immediately betrayed me. Who? Mrs. Harper raised an eyebrow. You know who. After she left, I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat. Simple. Meet me in the West Garden at 6. Ethan. I stared at the note for nearly 10 minutes. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Another part already knew I would not. At exactly 6 o'clock, I found him standing beside the old stone fountain. The garden glowed beneath the setting sun. Golden light filtered through the trees. Water drifted softly over weathered stone. Everything felt calm. Too calm. Ethan turned when he heard my footsteps. Thank you for coming. You made it sound important. A faint smile appeared. It is. My stomach tightened. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he handed me a large envelope. Confused, I opened it. Inside were documents. Professional documents. Architectural sketches. Design proposals. My breath caught. What is this? An opportunity. I looked up. Ethan's expression remained serious. One of our foundation projects is renovating community centers across the city. I blinked. Okay. They need design assistance. My heart began beating faster. Ethan, he continued before I could interrupt. I reviewed the sketches you corrected. Heat immediately rushed into my face. You were not supposed to see those. I am glad I did. The words landed harder than they should have. I looked back at the papers. Professional plans. Real projects. Real possibilities. Things I had stopped allowing myself to dream about years ago. I am a maid, I whispered. Ethan shook his head. That is your job. His eyes never left mine. It is not who you are. Silence settled between us. Heavy. Emotional. Dangerous. Because a small part of me wanted desperately to believe him. I cannot afford to dream anymore, I admitted quietly. My mother needs me. Ethan nodded slowly. I know. Then you understand. No, his answer surprised me. I understand that you gave up your future for someone you love. His voice softened. What I do not understand is why you think that sacrifice has to last forever. I looked away quickly. The emotion rising inside my chest felt too large. Too overwhelming. Before I could respond, another voice echoed from the pathway. There you are. Charlotte. She stood several yards away with Victoria beside her. Neither woman looked pleased. Victoria's eyes moved from me to the envelope in my hands. Then to Ethan. Understanding appeared instantly. You are serious, she said quietly. Ethan's expression hardened. Very. Victoria stared at him for a long moment. Then she asked the question everyone had been thinking. And if the family objects? The garden suddenly felt very still. Ethan never hesitated. Then the family will have to learn how little that matters. The weeks that followed changed everything. Not all at once. Not like a fairy tale. Real life never worked that way. Change arrived quietly. One decision at a time. One opportunity at a time. One act of faith at a time. I continued working at Blackwood Manor while helping with the community center project. During the day, I organized guest rooms and managed household responsibilities. At night, I reviewed blueprints, studied layouts, and worked on design proposals until my eyes burned from exhaustion. Yet for the first time in years, the exhaustion felt different. It carried purpose. Hope. The project grew quickly. Soon one community center became 3. Then 5. My ideas were being implemented. Real families would use those spaces. Real children would learn there. Every completed design felt like reclaiming a small piece of the life I thought I had lost. My mother's health also began improving. Slowly. Steadily. The new treatment plan was working better than expected. Her smile returned more often. Her laughter sounded stronger. Every hospital visit felt a little brighter than the last. One Saturday afternoon, she looked at me from her hospital bed and said, "You smile differently now." I laughed. "What does that mean?" "It means you stopped surviving." Her eyes softened. "And started living again." 2 months later, Blackwood Holdings hosted a public ceremony celebrating the completion of the first renovated community center. Reporters gathered. Investors attended. Local families filled the courtyard. Children ran across the playground beneath bright blue skies. The entire space felt alive. I stood near the back of the crowd, hoping nobody would notice me. Old habits were difficult to break. Then Ethan stepped onto the stage. The applause was immediate. He thanked the sponsors, the volunteers, the city officials. Then he surprised everyone, including me. "There is one person whose contribution made this project possible," he said. My stomach instantly tightened. Ethan looked directly toward me. Grace Carter. Hundreds of faces turned. My heart nearly stopped. The vision behind these spaces came from someone who spent years believing her dreams no longer mattered. The crowd remained silent, listening. She reminded all of us that talent does not care about social status. Character does not care about wealth. And potential does not disappear simply because life becomes difficult. Emotion rose inside my chest so suddenly I could barely breathe. Ethan extended his hand. "Grace. Would you join me?" The walk to the stage felt unreal. Yet when I reached him, I saw something in his eyes I had never fully understood before. Pride. Not because of what I had done for him. Because of what I had done for myself. After the ceremony ended and the crowd began dispersing, we found ourselves standing alone near the garden entrance. The evening sunlight painted everything gold. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan smiled. "You know, when I first saw you, you were carrying a tray." I laughed softly. "And wearing a terrible uniform." "Very terrible." We both smiled. Then his expression became more serious. "The truth is, Grace, you changed this place." I shook my head. No, my voice trembled slightly. "You did." Ethan looked toward the families laughing across the courtyard. "Maybe." Then he glanced back at me. "Or maybe the right people simply deserve someone who believes in them." I looked around at the children playing, the parents smiling, the life unfolding in front of us. Everything I once thought was impossible suddenly felt real. And in that moment, I finally understood something my mother had been trying to teach me all along. The people who judged me saw a maid. The people who truly knew me saw a person. And sometimes the greatest act of love is not being rescued. It is being reminded that you were never invisible to begin with.